Thank you everyone for gathering here today. We're very excited to talk about the future of cities. My name is Chen. I am a SHAC grad student, also the editor-in-chief, one of the editors-in-chiefs of Blueprint, a student publication. And we're here to co-host this event with Professor Kwatinetz. I'm also an associate at Green Hollow Capital, working on distressed equity and debt investments. Now I'd like to pass it off to Professor Kwatinetz to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Ivan. So excited to be here with you and with Blueprint. I've been really impressed with everything that Blueprint has been doing for the last couple of years, and excited to have this event. I'm Professor Kwatinetz, also known as Professor K, or just Chef. A lot of my students call me. I teach urban economic development and also real estate economics and market analysis. And I'm also the faculty director of the Urban Lab, where we have some great research projects going on around cities, agglomeration, and different kinds of regenerative infrastructure and inclusive growth. Thanks, Victor. Appreciate that. Back to you, Ivan.
Yeah, and to give a little overview of Blueprint for those of you who are new to the publication, it's a student-run publication that covers emerging trends. We have students across NYU, from Stern to Wagner to SHAC, and we all come together and really look at where the industry is going and provide our own thoughts and research. And 3 times every semester, we publish this in Blueprint. So if you're interested in reading from our publication, I am posting a link in the chat here, so you can follow us on LinkedIn. And if you're an NYU student and you're interested in joining Blueprint as a journalist, there's also a link to fill out a contact form. So I'd love to generate more buzz going for the publication. To start off, I'd like to touch about, with the pandemic, we saw a lot of photos of an empty New York City. Here's a photo of Times Square, what used to be a bustling sector of the city, was quiet for several months. We also saw the news articles of, New York is not going to be the same as it ever was, or San Francisco is not going to be back again. And it really leads us to the question: are cities in decline? First, I think I want to touch on pandemic migration. Some of the numbers here from the second quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2021, major cities in the Sun Belt, from Phoenix to Houston, Dallas, Austin, these cities collectively gained 300,000 new residents who moved to the area. And in the same time frame, major metro areas, gateway cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco lost 700,000 residents combined. I'd like to pass it off to Professor Kwatinetz to talk about, how does declining population affect a city?
Great question. I think to start with, I just want to comment on your chart that you have here with net, permanent, and temporary moves, and comment that the trend of people leaving cities was grossly exaggerated in terms of permanent moves. Mostly speaking, we saw a dip in new migration, but as shown in this chart, that pretty much has now reverted to the mean of the same amount of migration coming in, both temporary and permanent. But to the question I actually asked, when a city loses population, it can be problematic or not based on what exactly the dynamics of the city are. So for example, in New York City, we've had a structural deficit of producing housing for people to live in on an annual basis going well back 30 years, where we're never able to produce enough housing for the number of people that want to move to New York City. That's one of the biggest reasons that we have such expensive housing here, because we can't keep supply up with demand. So what actually happened when we saw a loss of residents, which was mostly temporary, is we saw a lot of people who own their homes leaving their home to go to a second home, find a second home, or go for van life or whatever it is they wanted to do, and enter their homes into the rental market. At the same time, as we saw a huge loss in demand in housing, when suddenly we had people who didn't need to come to school and have an apartment that they were renting, or come to work, or come for tourism, we saw a huge decrease in demand for housing at the same time as we saw a huge increase in supply for rental housing. And that led to those temporary dips in residential rental rates, even though you may have noticed that from the for sale product, condos and homes, we actually saw prices go up throughout the entire pandemic and did not see any decline. But in general, when we think about a city, we think about an economy of scale and the ability for a city to have a certain amount of population to spread the costs of the city's scale, things such as transportation or cultural offerings, amongst many, many people that increase the quality of life for all those people, as long as we can avoid the diseconomies of scale and of agglomeration. When we don't develop enough housing, for instance, in New York, we find excessive pricing for housing or excessive congestion in the streets. So really, this little cyclical dip in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, I think mostly is a cyclical dip in the sense that it will probably come back to pre-pandemic levels of moving. But at the same time, a lot of people discovered that they can live in other cities and still maintain their quality of life. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But if you want to look at a city that really has not recovered from losses of population, Detroit is usually the example we use, because Detroit was built out at a scale that its population never achieved. So what can happen in those instances, and what people have been worried about happening now, is a return to the time of the 70s, when we saw a lot of out-migration of populations from cities, but still had to try to maintain an infrastructure as if we had a higher population. And that led to declines in how much money the cities had to spend on services like safety, transportation, all of those kinds of things. So that's everybody's big worry, that we're going to see a recurrence of that and see a hollowing out of cities that can't afford to provide for the populations that we have. The data does not show anything like that anywhere that I have seen. There is no hints that that is going to happen. It's a fear that many people have that aren't looking at what the data show. So I think currently feel pretty comfortable that the 10,000 years that has led to increasing amounts of population in cities regularly throughout 10,000 years, we are not going to see a reversal of that. We might see a redistribution into cities that have lower tax burdens or better qualities of life, but that's the competition between cities that's constantly going on, that we expect to continue, and that keeps cities developing and becoming sharp and not falling behind their peers.
Yeah, and those are some great points, Professor K. And really adding to that is the rate of inflation we've seen has dramatically increased in 2021. Looking at the consumer price index, it was an alarming 7% nationwide, which is levels we have not seen in decades. But when you start drilling in and looking at it from a local level, if you look at the graphs on the right, certain cities like Atlanta, Tampa, and Phoenix, which are in the Sun Belt and seeing large amounts of migration, are seeing some of the highest inflation increases across the country. Meanwhile, in New York, San Francisco, Boston, gateway cities that had not seen that migration and perhaps have seen a little bit of out-migration, has some of the lowest inflation of the entire country. So would love to pass it off to you to talk about, for these cities with rapid growth, how can they be negatively impacted by some of these changing demographics?
Great question. Inflation is obviously at the top of the news cycle right now. Everyone is very interested in inflation. I noticed this morning that finally a lot of pundits on Bloomberg and economics news outlets started saying, maybe the Fed is right and this is transitory. And the reason that we've seen such high inflation in certain areas generally can be tied to 2 or 3 different effects most of which feel like they could be short-term. The short-term versus long-term is really important so that we understand if there is a structural change or if this is a temporary event. Now, a temporary event where we see gas prices as high as over $6 in Mammoth, California this morning, that's a big problem. I'm not trying to say it isn't, but we want to understand, has something structurally changed or are we in a temporary moment? The reason why many of us, myself included, think that we are primarily in a temporary moment across the whole set of cities in the United States, and then we'll deal with the Sun Belt, but across the whole set of cities, we think it's temporary because there are very specific causes why we're seeing an uptick in consumer prices, which is what is shown here. Those causes have to do with things that you've all heard about. The stopping of manufacturing due to COVID, leading to less supply being available, even if demand were constant. But because at the same time, demand for goods went up because people suddenly had more money in their pockets. Why they have more money in their pockets? Not all people, but certain consumers had more money in their pockets. There was generally a division between working class and office class. And office class had more money than they've had before, saw a rise in wages, and they couldn't go out and spend money on things like restaurants, travel, et cetera. And so a lot of them plowed money into purchasing goods at the same time as manufacturers were stopped from manufacturing as many goods. So you saw an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. Then you had a compounding factor, which was the supply chain itself, the delivery of goods being bottlenecked. You saw the boats lined up outside of Newark, outside of LA, outside of all these other places that caused additional supply shocks that made prices go up even more. Now we also have the war going on, which is really causing an increase in commodity prices, especially oil. And I heard someone say very smartly, a Fed official said this morning, we're not a farm to table or factory to table society. We're a farm to truck to table and factory to truck to table society. So that means that when gas prices go up, that also is increasing the price of getting things to where they are. So all those factors are temporary factors that are leading to a huge increase in the CPI. And then at the same time, what's brought up on this slide is the idea that some Sunbelt and smaller cities are getting huge influxes of population. And that population in general is coming from areas of higher average wages. And so that population is willing in particular to spend more money on housing or on rent in general for office as well, because their basis for where their income is coming from, either as a company or as an individual, is from a higher income area. So when they come to this Sunbelt area where prices are lower and there's not as much supply and lots of new demand, they're willing to bid it up beyond what an average price would have been in the area. So this is also a short-term effect. Even if those people wind up staying in those locations, those people and companies, the market then responds by producing more supply. That supply has been gated by all the different factors that we've been talking about. The one that we also did not talk about is the Great Resignation and the rise in labor cost, which in general, if we look at the history of how much people are being paid in this country, there's been a rise in the incomes to capital and to businesses, but not to people for a very long time. And so in the pandemic, we're seeing a readjustment where labor is asking for wages that more match the returns that other segments of the economy have gotten to, and they won't work for less than that. That combined with getting unemployment and having savings has led them to stay out of the workforce. We're now seeing that change, and we're seeing all of the wages go up. Those wages go up also means that the price of goods goes up, but also that people's spending power is going up. So people are worried about that also causing a cycle of inflation. But I think, again, we'll see a reversion to the mean as we see a balance of where people are going to live, balancing out between the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt and urban core on the coasts. And then we'll also see a response from the real estate development industry to create more supply in areas where that can happen. But some areas are supply constrained and also can be congestion constrained. Places like Atlanta are extremely constrained by the amount of transportation that is available to go to one place or the other, whereas places like Phoenix have a lot of room to grow. Tampa has a lot of room to grow. So I think we'll see differential results in each of these areas as to how these cities play out. But in general, people want a higher quality of life. And in this moment right now, they are relatively indifferent between living in a Sunbelt city and living in New York. So all other things being equal in terms of salary and flexibility, they'd rather live in a warmer and cheaper place. That probably won't last in terms of those things being equal on all other levels, but I think the jury is out on that one, Ivan.
Thanks, Professor K. We touched on this a little bit earlier about work from home. As we've seen in Manhattan, apartment rents are back to pre-pandemic prices, but only 30% of office workers are currently back in the office, and that number is even lower in San Francisco at 30%. From a recent PwC survey in 2022 of CEOs, 72% of organizations currently offer hybrid work, while 43% say that they will continue to provide hybrid work options for their employees going forward. So the question is, has work from home made cities less competitive?
It's a great question, Ivan. Those students that are in my course have heard me talk about this quite a lot, so I'll try to say something new. I think that work from home and hybrid work is here to stay in a certain level. But throughout the pandemic, some things that I think are not taken into in some of these surveys, and I don't know this particular survey, maybe you know and can answer this, but the amount of office employees as a whole has gone up during the pandemic, even while they haven't been in the office. We've seen a great deal of hiring and expansion in high income office work, in particular tech. At the same time, we've seen a halting of building office. So what we're seeing is eventually there will be an increase in overall office demand and a decrease in the amount of space that is available. And so there may be a resorting here on a couple of different fronts. Number one is when we say hybrid work, the real question is how much will someone be required to be in the office and how often? The benefits that we get from being in an office mostly come from being in an office at the same time. The benefits of being in an office from a company perspective, not from an employee perspective. From a company perspective, we get benefits when people are together in the office. And so even those offices that only require people to come sometimes will generally want to have enough space for everyone to be there at certain times, or they're going to have additional demand for other spaces where everyone can be together. So either way, I think there's still a significant amount of office demand out there. And there's been a halt in delivering office at the same time as we also have started seeing offices convert to other uses. Let's make no mistake, this is not going to change rapidly. But over time, I do not see a world in which Midtown Manhattan is in trouble because there aren't enough office users. What I do see is a recognition of people, especially in this current administration in New York, that any single use area, whether it's only office or only residential, doesn't really reflect the way we as humans want to live and causes there to be big swings in what is possible in certain areas. So I think we will see some additional development of residential in those areas to balance out the fact of only having an office population. But ultimately, what has happened with work from home, in addition to all this, is that now individuals have the opportunity to work from other places. I think many people are finding, not all people, but many people are finding that regardless of where they work, they would like to work in an office, that working actually specifically from your own home, while it has some benefits, particularly when you're rearing children that are at home, that can't go to school or that haven't gone to school yet, there are a lot of benefits from that. But ultimately speaking, there are benefits from being in the office as well. But a lot of people now have the option to work from an office in a different city, at least for part of the time. What I believe is going to happen is that this will become a competitive advantage for a company that allows me as an employee to work from wherever I want, but also occasionally have to come back to the main office. And I think what that will mean is that from an individual employee basis in some of these high-end office areas, not all areas, but some of these high-end office areas, you're going to have more demand for the same single individual for office. Some of it will be co-working demand when they're in another city, and some of it will be conferencing and gathering demand when they're in the home city. And so I don't see a world in which structurally we're going to decrease the amount of office space we have. I do think it is going through one of the biggest changes it's had in a while, and that will continue to see the trends towards flexible office as a service, co-working office, because there will be a lot of different kinds of needs for scaling up and down on a seasonal basis, and also as companies grow. What is really interesting is it used to be that the salary that you got from a particular office was relative to the location of the home office, because you were working in the home office. So if I worked in New York, because the cost of living was so much higher, I would get a higher salary. Recently, a survey came out from Cranes that showed that now tech workers who work in New York in the office have the same salary as tech workers who work for a New York firm and can work from wherever they want. Hawaii, maybe a bad example because it's more expensive than New York, but let's say Charlotte or Charleston, they can work from places that have a lower cost and get the higher salary. I'm very curious to see if that persists or if we start seeing a differential in salary where companies want people to be in the office and pay them a premium for a certain amount of time spent in the office. I don't think we'll see it making cities uncompetitive, because in the end, rural areas and smaller areas without cities don't have the infrastructure to sustain larger populations of office workers, or they have to build that infrastructure and become cities. So I do think we'll see a reshuffling again of the competitiveness of cities and where I want to be as an individual, what kind of amenities I want, where I can work and have high-speed internet and have restaurant options and have hoteling options, whether I want to be in a big New York City with all of the cultural and quality of life options I have. And let's not underestimate having peers around me of my age that I want to interact with. I want to go out with them. I want to meet my future partner. I want to have parties. I want to have a lifestyle that involves people of my age. And that generally has been one of the biggest trends that's led to larger cities. I don't think we're going to see that part go away either.
Thanks, Professor K. And to also touch on offices, we've seen a lot of companies seeking that Class A office space to attract employees to come back into the space. But we've also seen a lot of Class B and Class C buildings in gateway cities struggling to lease space and having the high vacancies. If you look at the graph on the right there, you'll see that the vacancy rates for older buildings in black have now dramatically increased over the vacancies of the office buildings, newer office buildings shown in pink. So it's a huge reversal from pre-pandemic, where more companies were looking at older spaces. Now companies are looking more for that newer space. So with the uncertainty of office from the investor point of view, it can be very risky to invest additional capital into a building to try and reposition it as a Class A or a Class B, given the headwinds that are being perceived right now. So I'd like to pass it off to Professor K to touch about how vacant office buildings can be reutilized for new spaces, and how perhaps government incentives will they be required to support these conversions.
Great question. Let's all remember two things. Number one, we all have to always be conscious in our field of real estate that real estate is cyclical, and that we go in these changes where one sector is oversupplied and one is undersupplied, and price and risk follow those cycles. So you'll notice in Q1 2019, the vacancy rate is lower in the offices that are built before 2000. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into such a calculation. Very hard to generalize from that one piece of information. However, a lot of that has to do with finding deals and the relationship of risk and reward. As we look into 2022, there's a lot of option for getting office occupancy at a better rates in a higher end building because supply is high and demand is low. And so the deals can be had in the Class A in a way that they weren't before. So when we talk about converting older office buildings, I certainly think that is an opportunity. However, there's also an opportunity to construct new office buildings or renovate old buildings at a time when the market in general doesn't believe that's a good idea. When the market doesn't believe something is a good idea, it could be that it actually is a terrible idea. Or it also could be that you're ahead of the cycle in a way where taking a risk will give you outsized returns. And picking up buildings that are older Class B buildings at this moment might be a good strategy because you can get them for a cheaper price. And you might think that the cycle is going to come around and get back to where you can make money off of those, buying them at a discount today because of the lower NOI and perhaps because of higher cap rates and people's general disbelief in the sector, and then waiting for the cycle to turn in your favor. All of that said, the particular question about repositioning office buildings and vacant office buildings, I think is a good question. You might take that strategy. You might take the acquisition and using them for something else strategy, acquisition and waiting out the cycle strategy, keeping them as office. But if you were going to adaptively reuse office, there are a lot of questions to consider. Office buildings are located and built with the idea that they will be office buildings. And for that reason, their corridor layouts, the water and ability to create additional bathrooms are such that when you start thinking about converting them to something like residential, which is the obvious conversion in this market, because people are also worried about retail, they're also worried about hotel, changing office buildings in central areas into industrial won't necessarily make sense, but you might get a small amount of those if you can get them for a cheap enough discount to make last mile centers, but mostly we're talking about changing them to residential. If you're going to change them to residential, you have a lot of work ahead of you in terms of infrastructure to be able to accomplish that. And by the time you get done with all that work, we're going to be at a different moment in the cycle. It is true that government can assist with these changes. They can assist by expediting permits. They can assist by creating additional infrastructure. They could assist by allowing conversions that aren't normally allowed. But the real problem you have in front of you is taking a building that was built with the infrastructure to be a particular use and trying to change it into a use that has a completely different load factor and need for windows, corridors, bathrooms, kitchens that really these buildings aren't meant to have. Now, should government give incentives for that to happen? I personally think no. I think they should expedite allowing those things to happen, allow people to spend their money to do those things. But right now, government should be focused on purchasing things that are cheaper and looking at stabilizing housing and housing supply at a larger scale before the cycle fully turns again. And yes, we are back to rents from before and housing from before, but it's going to continue going up from here. So even in this moment, I think how far the public dollar can go, I don't think handing incentives to developers to convert office buildings that I personally think will be needed again later is a great move. If there are some buildings that the developer can figure out how to convert without those incentives and just with the expediency of a government partner, improving the permitting process, improving the zoning, that would be a great use of government time to get more housing supply into the market.
Yeah, those are great points. Thanks, Professor. I'd like to pivot now to something that is probably pretty fresh in all our minds, how cities will adapt to climate change. As you see from the photo there, that was the aftermath of Hurricane Ida last year with the flooding of New York City. Our aging infrastructure hasn't stood up to the extreme weather driven by climate change. But to touch on the impact of climate change, the Hurricane Ida claimed 115 lives and $65 billion in damage along the East Coast last year. We also have seen other natural disasters, from an ice storm in Texas that strained the power grid and led to widespread power outages and freezing temperatures inside homes. And then we have the wildfires in California that has created tremendous economic damage and severely polluted the air during those times. So I'd like to pass out to Professor Kay to touch on how the resiliency of cities can be improved in the face of climate change.
This is one of the most exciting areas for cities for me personally. You might know, or maybe not, I'll do a shameless plug, that the Urban Lab right now at NYU is working a lot on investigating FDR Drive and understanding as we rebuild the FDR Drive and think about things like sea level rise and other forms of climate change, and also think about the changes in use of transportation, which we're going to get to in a slide or two, how we think about the nature of our city and its future for the next 50 or 100 years. It's great that we're having those conversations because it feels like it's only through climate change that we're starting to have a more long-term vision about how to think about cities. I will say I was here during Hurricane Sandy, and I was in Texas right before the ice storm and was working for Texas at the time when the power outages and the power went up to these huge areas because of the non-regulation. I also was in California and Nevada in the summer working outside when we had air quality indexes that were over 500. To be clear, over 90, you're supposed to go inside. And we were working outside at 500. So what do we do about all of this? This is really a place where all of you moving into your careers are going to play a critical role. And we've had something happen that has not happened as long as I've been alive, which is an outpouring of capital, of market motivated capital into the ESG space and into the sustainability space. That's a direct result of your generation and your preferences. And we need to make sure, sorry for the siren here, also in Midtown, we need to make sure that we are creating projects that speak to climate change at the same time as they speak to capitalism, because there is not enough money in the government and in donations and nonprofits to address this problem. What we actually need to do is completely reshape how we are building infrastructure and cities. The good news is that because we haven't really invested in infrastructure in this country, at least in a long time, is that everything's ready to be rebuilt. So we actually have in front of us one of the biggest economic opportunities that has existed since the New Deal. We really did not see an infrastructure bill of significance that addressed climate change come through the Obama administration nor the Trump administration. I hope that under President Biden and moving forward in individual governors and cities, governors and states, and also cities and mayors, that we can look at an entire reshaping of cities around these issues of climate change, and in particular, the infrastructure, the creation of regenerative infrastructure that can decongest our cities, move transportation onto the water where possible, create interactions with the water's edge, and figure out how to be more in line in cities that blend the difference between city and the rural and world's edge in order to make them, instead of them being islands trying to keep nature out, trying to figure out how we merge these things together. There's so much to talk about here. We will be doing some more panels on this subject in particular, but I will say as a side note, there's a lot of new work going into the concepts of regenerative infrastructure. Infrastructure that, because of its existence, actually is making the world better, not only not doing damage, but making it better when you start thinking about things like offshore wind and the use of waste and compost to create energy. These are the kinds of things we really need to reshape our entire industry around, because this is the pathway for the future for cities to be successful.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Caden. We'll be discussing a little bit later about some of the impacts of the infrastructure bill. So a lot to be potentially excited for in the future. And for our third topic here, we want to discuss how cities will be shaped by mobility. Prior to the pandemic, we saw a lot of focus on transit-oriented development, But with the pandemic, it's very much shaped how we travel and move around. Public transportation has had a slow recovery. To give you some numbers, the MTA subway ridership is still down 41% of pre-pandemic levels, while the bridge and tunnel traffic is already back to pre-pandemic levels. So it's shown that we've changed our ways of transportation for the last 2 years. To be determined if it'll continue this way. With 39% of US adults looking at considering electric vehicles, these electrical vehicles will require a whole network of charging stations, which will be a massive undertaking to the $5 billion that has already been earmarked for EV stations in the recent infrastructure bill. And this is EV stations by highways, in people's homes, in their workplaces. It requires an entire network to which Tesla and other companies have already started putting together. But once EVs take a larger market share, these infrastructure upgrades need to go to the next level. Also wanted to touch on how when autonomous vehicles become more widely used, there will be a dramatic shift in the requirement for parking. Right now in the US, we have 8 parking spots approximately for every car. And if we can recapture some of that parking lot space and reutilize that for development and more useful uses, I think that would dramatically change the landscape of some of our city centers. So as the pandemic has reshaped how people move around, Professor Kwatinetz, which of these trends do you think will be here to stay?
A lot here, as always. You've done a great job getting some juicy topics here. The trend that I hope is here to stay is the trend of de-automoting our cities. I think there is way too much space being given in cities to cars. Those cars are taking up parking spaces and physical space that would be much better dedicated to public space, to recreational space, to supply chain and freight space. We really have what we've been calling at the Urban Lab a congestion crisis. We saw during COVID the expansion of restaurants into street spaces and street seating. We saw first during the Bloomberg and then during the de Blasio administration of the taking back of certain streets and creating pedestrian plazas. And I think we need to move more automotives and single occupancy vehicles out of cities and take back some of these parking spaces and turn them into productive uses, whether those are low income targeted uses for things such as clinics or artist use or restaurants, or whether they are just green space or recreation space to allow people more mobility throughout the city, or there are such things as shutting down 42nd Street to vehicles, which is something I would desperately like to see, because now that we've shut down the interior of Times Square, we've shut down Broadway to vehicles, we now have much more mobility, but then it gets stuck right at the areas where we have huge train stations, bus stations, and transportation nodes. We're again squeezing people into this small area. The streets a long time ago were public space. They were a place where people played and had a right of way just as much as any car. I think we've lost something significantly by giving over the central veins of our cities to cars. And I'm hoping that with the changes we're seeing in technology, the changes from COVID, the changes in mass transit, in climate change, and in autonomous vehicles, that we could permanently take space away from cars. We know that cars will fill whatever space we give them. So however many more roads we build, we will have the same or more congestion. People are different. People, we have a fixed number of people, and as we add more room for them to move around, it's going to allow the lifeblood of a city, those people, to move around, shop at businesses, interact with each other, have moments of intellectual stimulation and exchange and artistic exchange that make the city a place that we more want to be. So that's the one that I hope stays around. I think electrical vehicle charging is certainly something that is going on, but I think it's a small piece. What we really need is electrical mass transit. We need electrical mass transit and to stop thinking about individuals having the right for their own car.
Thanks, Professor K. And yeah, that wraps it up for the main topics we were covering. I wanted to open up the questions now, and let's see.
It's like we have two from Victor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. Do you want to take a run at any of the questions, Ivan, or do you want me to?
Yeah, you want to take a first pass at it?
Sure. So Stacy, thanks for your question. To accommodate companies' needs for more office space and lab space, warehouse, et cetera, do you think that will lead to more high rises or more buildings in further away urban areas and suburban areas? Well, I think what we're seeing is right now, I think you're referring to the comment I made that we're seeing an increase in demand overall for office space that has not yet materialized in the marketplace because of work from home. I believe that you're now saying, well, if that's true, does that mean we're going to see even more building? Well, right now we are seeing some more building that is happening in further away urban areas and suburban areas. And I am part of a group that's redeveloping malls for this very purpose, because we can see a higher quality of life in transit-oriented areas and a lower cost of doing business. We are seeing a vast expansion of lab space in general, as we're seeing more demand for that, and a vast expansion of warehouse space overall. Although most warehouse space demand will happen in the outer ring of cities, just because of the cost of real estate and the efficiency of building in-city real estate for warehouse use, which is generally lower land value than office or land space. So I do think right now we're seeing a stop in building office space, and we're going to see a crunch that leads to a vast increase in pricing. Good news for Ivan's fund that is buying office space. Once that happens, you'll see the development machine start up again and realize, hey, maybe we should build some office space. And as usual, they'll oversupply it, and then we'll see that cycle go again. So hopefully I answered that question for you. Victor's next question, do we see outsized demand for A versus B versus C? I think that's what we were seeing in the slides that were shown earlier. Ivan, maybe you want to go back to that slide. We're seeing a higher demand for A, and exactly what you're saying here, Victor, newer offices with more amenities, closer to major transportation hubs. Yes, they absolutely are going to attract and retain talent more than those not like that, especially in a work from home world where people are occasionally coming in. They're going to want to not have a two-seat ride. If I'm coming in from far away, I want to come in and from the transit station, not take another subway. I want to just walk to my office from the transit station. I want it to be shorter. So I think we'll start out with that being at the higher level, as we're seeing here, lower vacancy in those class A, shown in the pink. And then as we see a lack of supply, just like with everything else, it'll start spilling out into other areas. Which areas do I see as prime? I do think the Penn Station area redevelopment is a fantastic move. People are looking at it the way they used to look at Times Square before that was redeveloped. Not quite as bad as that, but they're talking about the transients and how it'll never be a nice area, and that's just false. We see that in history. I think Vornado has a great opportunity here with the state to deliver something exceptional in the heart of Manhattan, in an area that you cannot beat the transit almost anywhere in the world because of those train stations, because of the bus, because of the subway, because of the walkability and the density. So I think those are going to be absolutely prime areas. And I would definitely be following a strategy like Vornado if I had money to spend and was interested in investing in office. I'd be investing between Port Authority, Penn Station, and Grand Central, and trying to figure out where in that area I could benefit and own things, because I'm seeing the public sector is going to just dump money into there, and they have locational advantages that really can't be beat. Yeah,
and we're also looking at Midtown East upzoning for office.
Yeah.
RXR has a new tower that's going up there. So there's a lot going on around Grand Central as well.
I'm going to skip to Professor Adornado's question before we go back to Victor's second question. Can e-bikes and e-scooters be a part of a long-term urban mobility solution? That's a great question. And I do think that they can be. I don't know if you heard before, I was talking about the congestion crisis. We only have so much square footage of public space in the form of sidewalk and bike lanes in the city. And we have been increasing and increasing the population with that same amount of fixed sidewalk space. Then at the same time, we now allowed restaurants to go into that space, further deteriorating the amount of sidewalk space we have. And finally, we allow companies like Amazon and Fresh Direct and Instacart to take over and use that space for supply chain. And now we have COVID locations in that space as well. So we're really losing a lot of space. Like the amount of square footage for all these uses is going away. That's why I think taking back some of these roads is essential in order to avoid collisions and crises. We saw e-bikes and e-scooters rolled out in many different locations throughout the country. And what generally happens is because there's no regulation, they wind up just being dumped and creating even more congestion, difficulty stumbling over them, no safety for pedestrians and older folks. So I think we really need to expand public space and public lanes. And then I would really love to see more e-bike and e-scooter mobility to allow for a reduction in car mobility as well. What do you think, Ivan? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think those are great points. Yeah, it's keeping e-bikes and e-scooters in bike lanes. And we've seen a lot of people zipping around on the sidewalk, and it's a safety concern.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's see. So I still see two more questions and one in the main chat from Mark Norman. So let's go with anonymous attendee, then we'll do Mark, then we'll go back to Victor. So anonymous attendee, you ask us, what segment of regenerative infrastructure do you see as an entry point for new construction companies and developers, possibly supported by this administration's incentives? But the lowest hanging fruit right now is community solar gardens. We really see a lot of support for solar in this state and in this locality, meaning the city, to provide those in local areas. The dollar amounts are still not very attractive if you don't have a large enough surface area to do those, but I do think it's low hanging fruit to get involved. And if you have water facing property, water adjacent property, getting involved with offshore wind is really a great move. Now, there are a lot of areas of New York that are perfectly ripe for geothermal. And also there are a lot of areas where, depending on what type of use you have, the collection of compost and use of anaerobic digestion or changing of trash into energy, waste into energy, I think are areas that are extremely evolved in other areas, and you could bring those in to the local area. But really, it's going to depend on what type of property you have, what is your scale, whether or not you have enough scale to create a regenerative system inside your own building, or if you're going to partner with others. One of the things that I really expect to see, just as we have business improvement districts all over the city, I'm hoping that soon we will start to see the creation of eco districts, districts where multiple building owners get together to create shared renewable and regenerative systems that make sense at scale, but not for an individual owner, and get offsets to their tax burden, help with CPACE financing, and the ability to get lower energy costs that make that pencil for them. But they will use their eco district in order to set up a financing mechanism just to get started. What do you think, Ivan? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you touched it. Did a good job touching it. Yeah.
Mark asks us, do you see a reckoning for REITs and our office owners between upcoming lease renewals and the return of office demand? Well, you're asking us to predict exactly when office will come back, which is a pretty tough prediction, but I do think that REITs have been facing that reckoning for the last couple of years now. I've particularly been watching Empire State Realty personally, because they do have this dislocation issue that you're talking about, which is that they have a need for delivering monthly and quarterly profits and returns, and they have a lack of payments in some of those. And a lot of people believe it's going to get a lot worse, which is Mark's point here, when these leases that have been long-term leases actually now are coming up for renewal. And the question is, will they come up for renewal before or after there's a return to office demand, or will there never be a return to office demand? I think that's why you see some users like Empire State trying to diversify into other asset classes, residential. I think that was a bold and possibly foolhardy move at the moment, but I think it reflects the desperation that they believe there is a reckoning coming up in the way you are suggesting here. I personally believe the long term is good, and we might see, when the scale is appropriate, a taking private of certain REITs into the private market to outlast this moment of the cycle, and then a public listing of them for some of them. I think we'll see some of them try to weather the storm, and we'll see some of them try to diversify into other areas. But certainly if I were running an office REIT, this would be number one on my mind, this question that you're bringing up. And I have not run the data to say how those lease renewals match with what we think return to work is going to look like, et cetera. But it's a great question. I wish we could say more about it. Oh, we have Scott Robinson, director of the REIT Center, also answering, more qualified to answer than I. He's reminding us all that REITs are well capped. Oh, go ahead, Scott. Why don't you speak?
Hey, Matt, sorry for being late to this. No, your answer was spot on. I would just add to it as I wrote. I think, REITs are generally very well capitalized, and everything you guys have spoken about is going to require not just creativity, but balance sheet to execute. And so I think we're going to see a lot of REITs playing a leadership role in repositioning assets compared to some of their private market brethren. And therefore, I would imagine that their assets will outperform. Of course, that puts aside the overall price reckoning that might be hanging out there in the office space later this year and into next year. But again, I think you really want to see the well-capitalized players in a market like that.
Great response. And thanks for jumping up here with us. If you don't mind staying, there might be more questions that we can tag team. Ivan, anything you want to add, or should we go to?
Yeah, I would add that a lot of tenants are looking to move to new spaces. EY just moved out of 5 Times Square to the Hudson Yards, Manhattan West area. So a lot of these tenants are looking to upgrade their spaces currently and move out to some of the nicer buildings.
Excellent, good answer. Going to Victor. Victor is asking us about mobility, efficiency, and sustainability. Thoughts on 15 or 20-minute cities, live, work, and play neighborhoods, the evolution of the CBD. The 15 and 20-minute city movement is about the concept that someone within 15 minutes of where they live can access all the goods that they need pretty much walking. And we can spread out the efficiency of cities by creating lots of different areas that are dense. New York City has long been a subscriber to that view. That was part of why Long Island City, downtown Brooklyn, Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and even Times Square, and also St. George and Staten Island, all of those were attempts to move to more of a hub and spoke model where there were minor hubs in that area. I think this is mirroring how cities originally evolved, and this is definitely the preference of most people, what they would like to see happen. The question is if we could get capital to support that in a long enough direction where we can see a differential of pricing in those 15-minute areas where people prefer to live in them in the way they prefer in CBDs. But that's certainly a better way of organizing cities. It will cut down on the congestion. It will cut down on carbon emissions. It will make it more equitable. It will make more areas more economically just. So I definitely am a supporter overall of 15 and 20-minute cities. That's what all cities used to be. That's what old European cities that we like kind of look like. The issues we have is how projects are financed and how locations are zoned. I don't know, Scott or Ivan, if you have anything.
Yeah, I'm going to push back just a little bit because I think one vantage point is while it's very convenient, it does decrease diversity. It really creates silos and pockets that could become very exclusive, right? And not really inclusive to other communities. People do live within, quote, communities, whether they're cultural or geographical. And so I think a solution, if we're going to focus on that, would be to increase mobility in the city, right? Mm-hmm. And so if jobs, we're increasingly work remote, and so you don't necessarily have to commute as far for jobs, but I would like to see better mobility in conjunction with more services and opportunities within the smaller footprints.
It's a great comment. One of the things that we've worked on with the Urban Lab is a design of the city that would connect 15-minute cities with bike and scooter lanes, as well as mass transit. One of the ways that I would push back on your pushback is just that right now we already are in walled cities that preference the rich in the CBD. And so in a lot of outlying areas in Coney Island, in the Bronx, in Staten Island, those people are being forced to spend their time commuting because they can't get jobs and local services where they are. So I think there's a certain amount of balance between our two viewpoints that would allow for maybe targeted areas which have been left behind, and not having the same amount of resources. You know, my family grew up in Crown Heights and Bensonhurst. You go to those two areas, it's a desert of jobs and certain kind of mobility. Thankfully, we just got a pool and a recreation center in Crown Heights that have been missing for 20 years. But we need to create some amount of equity in some of these outlying areas. Maybe it's not every 15 minutes, but the concept of having places having equity across the city, I think is an important one.
No, you're right. Food deserts and health and wellness deserts as well are an issue. So for sure.
Yeah, I'd like to pose to the panel, what are your thoughts on the rise of instant delivery from Gorilla or Amazon Prime? Is that changing the thought of what a 15-minute city looks like?
Do you want to go first, Scott?
Look, I grew up in the suburbs of California. I moved to the city because I can literally walk to a deli, a bodega, a local market, and get pretty much whatever I want 24 hours a day. I didn't move to the city to sit on my sofa to have somebody deliver that to me. So, you know, not necessarily against them. I'm just not necessarily a big fan of them.
I'll add and say that in a world in which we care about the climate and we care about equity amongst people, instant delivery is very in conflict with both those concepts. And also it only works in certain dense areas. We're old enough to have experienced the previous rise of delivery. There have been 2 attempts with, remember, Cosmo and I can't remember the other names. And what winds up happening is that certain rich areas where it's easy to walk and get stuff, you can pay someone to get stuff for you. But it's very hard to scale into some of these other locations, and leads to an enormous amount of building and congestion that isn't in line with the sustainability that can happen from a city. Now, I'm a consumer of instant delivery, maybe more than Scott. So I can talk on both sides of it, but my politics are against instant delivery, even though my pocketbook might have occasionally used it.
Yep.
So it looks like we have 2 more questions and we're kind of out of time. Do we have time, Ivan and Scott, to stay on for 5 more minutes and answer these 2?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So we have Anna asking if there are possibilities of conversion of hotel office space, how long would zoning adjustments take to make the conversions happen? It's a fascinating topic. If you've been following the government moves and the news, there was about $100 million allocated from the state to try to promote nonprofits converting hotels into homeless shelters. And what has wound up happening is that by the time the money became available, it's not enough to compete with market actors that are keeping them hotels. We talked earlier about office space and how it's going to be an extraordinary lift. It's going to be a very big infrastructure cost to change that office into residential in most cases. It's not so much how long the zoning takes. I think we're seeing the willingness to expedite zoning, but the lack of transactions happening because it doesn't make a lot of economic sense to do that, except in a world where you think office and hotels are never coming back. And I don't think that most people think that, but the zoning can happen very quickly, unless it's a public site, in which case it has to go through an 18-month ULURP process. But if it's a non-public site, they can do something quicker than that. And I think they have attempted to do that.
You know, it's a good question because I was thinking about it actually this morning. I was reading about an issue currently going on in CB2. I would like to work with some students to pursue a research project where I could marry the REIT structure with some antiquated or closed hotels, along with homeless services and impact investors, to really do more to address what I'll call it the full cycle of homelessness, right? There's a downward spiral that I think we need to address, as well as the reintegration efforts. And I think just simply having a homeless shelter, quote unquote, does nothing to stem either the downward spiral or really support that reintegration effort. So I think I would love to pursue some research like that in the REIT Center. So if any students are interested, definitely reach out to me.
That sounds really interesting, Scott. I'm very interested in reading that. What are your thoughts on ghost kitchens and food delivery service? Do you see them as an emerging asset type? Ooh, emerging asset type. This question came up in my class earlier this week, if food halls were an asset type. And I'm really interested in Scott's comments. I'm going to set him up so I don't just throw it to him. But when we talk about asset types, we're talking about a marketplace. We're talking about the fact that there's enough similarity in an asset and enough ability to characterize it that it starts trading as its own type and not as a singular opportunity, but in comparison to other assets of that type. In order to reach that scale, you really need to see a lot of them appear before what I hear in the question is this an asset type like industrial and office and all of that? To me, ghost kitchens are a specialty type of industrial, and I don't think they're going to emerge with their own, full pursuant asset type as a whole, because I think it would just take more volume. That doesn't take anything away from them as an investment opportunity. It's just when I hear asset type, I hear institutional lenders looking at them and comparing them across different marketplaces with certain characteristics. I'm interested in what you think about this, Scott.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And I think another way to think about it is how a specific use could evolve. And so, studio production space, for example, is a user, but now it's becoming actually an investable property type to some degree. Indoor agriculture has started off as a user, but I think it's becoming its own investment class. Esports arenas and facilities started off as a user, now possibly becoming its own, target segment. So I think certain things, as you said, depending on the size and scale, can start to become a segment, but I don't know if they really become a standalone property type like office is. One thing I would kind of touch on the ghost kitchen is getting back to zoning and the use of space. We all know retail as it used to be is long dead, and there's got to be a reuse and repurposing of it. And so for companies like, let's say, Fabric, who does last mile micro fulfillment, it's highly automated, a little bit different from a ghost kitchen, but I'd put it in a very similar category where we're going to have to address zoning to have flexible reuse of antiquated type of space.
Excellent. Ivan, you want to take us home?
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining today. It's been a pleasure to discuss the future cities with you. And yeah, if you're interested in joining Blueprint, if you're an NYU student, please shoot me a message, and otherwise you can follow us on LinkedIn from the chat earlier. And yeah, thanks again everyone, and hope to see you soon in future ones.
Thanks for having us on. This was a great panel. Always very impressed with the work of Blueprint and your editors. So appreciate you giving us this time, Scott and myself, to talk about this topic. Really interesting.
Awesome job. Thanks.
Thank you.